electric vehicles are no longer the future in Asia. They are very much the here and now. In China, EVs dominate the market. Charging networks are found across the country, and local brands like BYD outsell Tesla and other rivals. China has the scale, the infrastructure, and a head start. But outside Asia's top economy, the picture gets a bit more complicated. It's dividing some communities, it's disrupting workforces, and raising questions like where do EV batteries go to die without becoming tomorrow's waste problem? So let's look under the hood to see how China is addressing these issues and examine the costs and benefits of wide scale EV adoption. I'm Arnold Gay, and joining me on the CNA Correspondent podcast is Bong Ying and Jack Board. Bong, I'm going to start with you. Hello, first of all, to the both of you. You are based in Shanghai. So I want to know what's buying a car like in China these days? I mean, no, this is a genuine question. Can I go to a showroom and say, I want a petrol-driven V8, like a Mustang, or, a Corvette, Stingray, or a Lexus LC500? Is that still possible?
Oh yeah, and first of all, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. And to answer the question, I think absolutely yes. But I must first preface that the experience has changed completely. And I think my colleague Kim Seong's piece in our series, when he looks at what's happening when China's EVs start aging, it captures an important framing for this. So in his piece, he described how China is moving from the buying phase of EV adoption into the living with it phase. So the buying part looks incredible, and the living with it part is where the real test begins. So if you visited a Chinese city 5 years ago and wanted to buy a car, you drive out to the edge of a town to a 4S dealership, and that's the traditional model that one building, handling, sales, service, spare parts, the lot. And it's very functional. You sit down, you talk about the engine specs, haggle a little bit, ask where to get your oil change, done. And that was buying a car. And what I saw in Hefei, and this is true across most big Chinese cities now, is completely different. So you walk into a shopping mall in the center of town, and there are 5 or 6 EV brand showrooms right next to each other. There's NIO, BYD, Xiaomi, XPeng, and they look like Apple stores and not car dealerships really. So they have big screens, software demos, the kids playing in a lounge area, and people wondering in a way that you will browse for a new phone. So the emphasis has shifted from what's under the hood to what's on the screen. And I spent time inside the NIO house in Hefei. It's the world's largest NIO house, and it genuinely doesn't feel like you're buying a car. It feels like you're joining a members club instead, because there's a cafe, a lounge, a kids corner. And the salesman I spoke to there, he spent 5 years at Volkswagen and another 5 at BMW before switching to NIO. And he told me that the conversation with customers has completely changed. So in the old world, people ask 2 things. Where do I buy and where do I get it serviced? Now they want to talk about battery health, software updates, how the battery swap network works, the driving range, the full experience of owning a car and not just buying it. And there's something in the buying culture, as Kim Seong pointed out, that a lot of Chinese consumers are now treating cars the same way that they treat phones. So buying for the specs and for the features and planning to upgrade within a few years. So
Okay, Bong, I'm just going to interrupt you very quickly here. Is it true that if you chose to, you could actually buy a car online without actually even going to the shopping mall or to the showroom anymore?
absolutely, and I think people do that, but I think the majority still prefer to buy a car offline because it's all about the hands-on experience, and the experience of buying a car offline is very much different from buying a car online, because like you get to actually see the car, see the models, interact with the customers, the dealers, test out the car, and it's a whole experience. And the showrooms have also evolved in a way that it's not just like an old traditional showroom where cars are on display, but there's a lot of tech involved as well. So it's pretty exciting.
Okay, I can see that. I want to ask you though. I mean, China has the lead. Is it going to stay the market leader? We know that, Beijing has an important role to play here in terms of building up the industry. Has the focus, for the government changed? Is it still very much, interested in making sure that EVs, it leads the EV market, or has its attention changed to other areas like AI or other advanced manufacturing?
I think first to answer that question, whether will China stay the market leader or is it starting to level off? So every analyst I've spoken to, they say no, that this isn't leveling off because we already know that China already accounts for around 60% of global EV sales. And a lot of analysts think that the domestic share of EVs could reach 60, 70, or even 80% within the 5 years. And Beijing is also very firmly behind it because last year, the State Council, they launched a big push to train 30 million workers by 2027 with government subsidies, and EVs, they are named priorities. So local governments are betting big as well. And Hefei, where I did my reporting, they want to build a *1 trillion car making cluster by 2027. But I think, as my colleague Melody Chan reported in her piece on lithium, China's advantage, it goes much deeper than just putting cars together because a lot of people assume that the power lies in mining lithium. But as her reporting shows, the real advantage is in the middle step, which is refining raw lithium into the battery-grade chemicals that actually go into the EVs. So, and further down the chain, China makes about 85% of the world's battery cells. So whoever controls refining has major influence over what EVs cost and how well they perform. And I think here's what's complicate the picture, and that's what I keep hearing when I was in Hefei. Being the leader in building cars is one thing. And what I found was a production side that is moving at an extraordinary speed, and a service side that multiple people describe to me as years behind. So China can mine the lithium, China can refine it, can build the battery, can put the car together, can sell it, but can it fix it afterwards? Can it build a second-hand market that people trust? And can it train enough mechanics and technicians to keep the cars on the road?
Okay, Bong, will come back to this question. Jack, I want to get you into the conversation. You are based in Bangkok, but you've been traveling, across Asia as well, looking at how various countries are playing supporting roles. You're looking at the impact, on their economies, but also how it's affecting their way of life. You were in Mongolia, and that's where I want to start because I hear that cowboys and stockmen don't ride horses there anymore.
Hi, Arnold. Yep, you're exactly right. They don't always ride horses these days. Guess what? They're driving EVs out in the desert. And I was just listening to Bong speak and just thinking, what a different world this is. High-tech malls and technology. And here I am out in the middle of the Gobi Desert, and we're talking about the same vehicles. So it just shows, I think, the span of this industry and how big the story is. So I went to Mongolia a few years ago, actually, and I was out there visiting nomadic herders. I was staying with them, and I wanted to get some shots of them herding their goats one early morning out in the middle of the desert. There's nothing, just this little family in their tent that they sleep in. And I was like, okay, I'm wondering how they're going to do this. And he jumps in his Toyota Prius, this old white battered Prius, and out he goes, and he's herding the animals. And these are extreme conditions. There are no roads. These are just like tracks through the sand and the rocks. And I just thought, this isn't the story I'm doing now, but this is a story. Why are all these Priuses out here in the desert, and where did they come from? So I wanted to go back and understand the issue. I spent time in the desert, in the grasslands. It really doesn't take long before you start to see these Toyotas out there, exclusively Priuses, doing the work that used to be done by animals. And I profiled this young guy. I think he was just in his early 20s. And he gave us a ride in his Prius as he went to herd his animals. So take a listen to his experience. His name, Namnan Suran Tubsren.
In winter, people mostly use Priuses to herd cattle. In summer, they ride motorcycles or horses. But during the cold season, the Prius is much warmer and more comfortable. It's like a heated motorcycle. You can even load a horse into it. We use it for herding sheep and cattle. There aren't any steep cliffs or rough terrain around here, so it drives fine.
And Arnold, the same thing's actually happening in the capital too. So if you ever visit Ulaanbaatar, you'll just see how a city is awash with Toyota Priuses. And at the time, I started playing this game with my producer to see who could spot the most Priuses in a row. And it became tiring because there's just so many of them. I think the most we got to was 8 of them in a row. They are everywhere. There are hundreds of thousands of these hybrids. Half of all cars in Mongolia are now these secondhand cars being exported from Japan. And there's a few reasons why it's happened. They obviously feel a need. They work in these really extreme hot and cold conditions, unlike the pure electric vehicles that Bong's talking about and that we're seeing more on our roads. And they're clean in a city that has some of the worst air pollution in the world. And critically, they're cheap. And they've done lots of miles in Japan. Their battery service period and their warranties expired. People don't want these old Priuses anymore. The batteries have become expensive to maintain and replace, so they offload them. And Mongolia is happy to take them in, and they become a really useful car over there.
It's an incredible story, Jack. I do want to ask you about your travels to other parts, of the region. Indonesia and the Philippines, seem to be playing supplier roles, at this time in terms of the EV market. Nickel, as I understand it, for Indonesia, copper for the Philippines. Can you help us understand how important they are in terms of the overall, the big EV picture, if you like?
Yeah, Southeast Asia's really important player in this world. And the way we framed the series, I guess, at the start was to look from life to death of these cars. And Southeast Asia is very much at the forefront of the birth of the EV cycle, the materials that are being used to create them. And when you're talking about nickel, we're talking about copper, these are extremely important metals. They are not peripheral materials to build an EV. Nickel is central to the batteries. Copper's used right across the whole vehicle, the wiring, the motor, the charging, the grids. So what we explored through the series, and it's worth taking a look at the story that my colleagues Nivel Rader and Wisnu Agung Prasetyo did in North Maluku, the visuals are incredible, is just how Indonesia has become one of the world's biggest nickel hubs. And that matters right now in direct EV industrial terms because it's moved beyond mining into domestic refining, into processing as well. The Philippines is a fascinating case. I traveled to southern Mindanao to look at Southeast Asia's biggest untapped copper gold deposits in a place called Tampakan. This is really remote, beautiful mountains, the worst roads that you can imagine, security guards right across this remote mountain. It's home to indigenous tribes. And there are really strong divisions that have been created by a project that's been delayed for decades because of environmental concerns. So at the heart of this is this idea that the Philippines has a resource base of essential metals for the green transition, and it wants to expand its clean industry offerings, but it's still earlier in the chain than Indonesia, and it's facing really hard questions about how to get where it wants to go. How far does it push? And I guess one of the key points to consider when we're talking about Southeast Asia is to understand that the EV boom is running through places that we don't see as a car buyer. These people who are in a shopping mall in China, they don't see the villages in North Maluku that have been turned into industrial towns. They don't see the mountains of Mindanao where families are, fighting amongst themselves. And these are really central to the story, just as much as those showrooms or the factories that are building these cars.
And Jack, we'll get to some of these issues, very shortly. But I do want to ask you a bit more about the ambitions, of these countries you were just talking about. Are they content, satisfied to be suppliers, or are they, building their own EV ecosystems?
I don't think they would say that they're satisfied just to become part of China's orbit. But that, in reality, is kind of what's happening right now. Indonesia is interesting because it's trying to build its own ecosystem. It's forcing more of the processing of these EVs to happen at home. And it's pushing further into these downstream processes that are really important to the EV value chain. It wants to make sure that it's not just exporting raw materials, because that delivers the least for the resources that are so painstaking and often environmentally damaging to extract. But at the same time, it's obvious that it's Chinese firms that have brought much of the capital, much of the technology. It's their speed and know-how that's allowed this domestic expansion to happen. So these industries kind of go hand in hand, even though they're somewhat pushing against each other, if that makes sense. Indonesia's using a bunch of different policies. It's got export bans, for example, industrial controls to keep more of its value at home. And that's given it a bit more room to shape the future, I guess, of how it fits into this EV cycle. But it's still deeply tied to China. The Philippines is much more exposed. I think we reported that 90% of Philippine nickel ore exports go to China. Anything that was extracted from Tabakan, if that project gets going, would go to regional smelters in China. So, China's still dominating these processes globally right now.
Understood. So both of you were alluding to some of the issues and problems, which have occurred because of this EV revolution, for want of a better description. Bong, okay, EVs look nice inside and outside in many cases, but obviously there are problems. I wonder if you can take us through what's happening. I mean, what sort of issues and problems are consumers facing, first of all? And the other one that you mentioned briefly earlier, what are suppliers, and others deeply involved in the ecosystem, if you want, facing?
I guess let me just start with the consumer side, because this is where I found connect directly with my colleague Kim Seong's reporting. He spent time with EV owners who are discovering costs that they have not thought about when they bought the car. So a younger owner told him that he found the operating system slowing down, the charging getting really sluggish, and the owner was told that fixing it could cost several thousand yuan. And this are not the kind of costs that people factored in at a point, of sale when they were buying a car. And just put things into perspective, a new battery pack in China can cost anywhere from 50,000 to over 100,000 yuan. And a new mass market EV costs about 100,000 to 150,000 yuan. So you could end up spending nearly as much on a new battery as on a new car. And most people just don't do it. They just drive shorter distances, they charge more often, or they sell the car earlier than they plan. And now what I found in Hefei is the other side of the same problem, that those aging cars, they need fixing, but is anyone actually equipped to fix them? So I spent time with this used car dealer. He's about 70% of his customers, they still pick petrol cars. And when I asked why, his answer was immediate. He said there's three worries. There's high mileage, there's fear of the car catching fire, and the battery condition. And he told me that once an EV has more than about 50,000 to 70,000 kilometers on it, most buyers won't touch it. So compare that with petrol, where 100,000 or 200,000 kilometers is perfectly normal. And what's interesting about this used car dealer is that he's not anti-EV. He's actually owned 3 EVs himself, and he recommends them to customers when charging is convenient. And he told me that this shift is happening gradually, that people are not just going to switch to EVs in large numbers overnight. And so you have the owners that my colleague spoke to, you have and then there's also most buyers who still choose petrol to play it safe. And I think there's also the trust problem that runs all the way from ownership experience to the resale floor. And fewer than 100,000 workers in China are actually considered skilled enough to repair the EVs. And fewer than 20,000 repair shops are dedicated to EVs in a whole country. So, and I want to tell you about one of those people who, kind of cobbled together in real time, basically acting on his own to repair EVs. And because I feel like his story kind of captures both the problem and the response. So this man, Zhao Fei, he runs a repair shop in Hefei, and he set up a traditional car repair shop back in 2013. And before 2019, a customer had brought in an electric car with a broken compressor, and none of his mechanics could figure out how to even safely take it apart, and nobody would touch it. And that was his wake-up call. So he paid off his own pocket to take his team to cities like Shenzhen, Chongqing, Hangzhou, where those are the bigger cities where EVs were more common, and there were actually garages with real experience. And when they got back, he bought 2 EVs with company money, one new and one secondhand, and they tore them apart piece by piece to understand how everything worked. And they even built their own tools because the right ones didn't exist yet back then. So Zhao told me if you don't move, you get eliminated. And the people I met who haven't made that leap were feeling exactly that pressure. And that's Xue, she's in her 50s, spent nearly 30 years fixing petrol cars with her husband, and she runs a really tiny shop at Anhui International Auto City. So when I walked down the lane to find her, half the shutters around her were down. The signs on the buildings were advertising, like flywheels, pressure discs, parts for engines that fewer people are driving every year. So her workshop was barely wider than a corridor. And her customer base is also shrinking from both sides. So people are driving petrol cars less, and EVs barely need servicing with no oil changes, no transmission fluid. And Zhao previously told me that a petrol car owner might come in 3 or 4 times a year, and an EV owner maybe will just come in once a year for a repair. So here's Xue, this car mechanic in Hefei who only works on petrol vehicles.
If learning EV repairs requires a large investment, you do not want to do it. If the investment is small and does not cost much, then learning a little might produce some results. But electric cars are too complicated. Next year will definitely be worse. If you're driving a lot, you'd switch to an EV. If you're not driving much, there's really nothing to fix. What is there to fix?
So when someone who has been doing this for 3 decades tells you that this year is difficult and next year will definitely be worse, you can hear that she's not guessing it. She knows where it's heading. But there's nothing coming her way. There's no affordable retraining, no program for people in her situation, and she's very much on her own. So I think there's something I found that connects what my colleague found on the consumer side to what I found on the worker side, is that early EV buyers, they mostly focus on savings and convenience, and they didn't anticipate the long-term trade-offs. And small shop owners like Xue, who built their livelihoods around a customer base that they expected to last. But what they didn't anticipate is how fast it will erode. So both sides are really discovering the real cost of this transition.
Jack, so that's pretty much the picture, from China as described by Bong. I'm wondering, what did you see in terms of some of the hidden costs? For example, battery waste. You were talking a little bit about social tensions in places like Indonesia and the Philippines as well. Can you take us through what's happening?
Yeah, I think what Bong is talking about there is when the cars actually exist, we wanted to understand the costs that start at the source where the EVs are born, and that the costs linger until the vehicles break down or they're no longer wanted, so where the EVs die. So in Indonesia, if we look at this boom, it's brought deforestation, the haze that we see across the country there, more reliance on coal-fired power, for example. It's taken over traditional fishing grounds. There's social disruption in villages. In the Philippines, that story is kind of similar. In Mindanao, of course, the project hasn't gone ahead yet, but there's this deep tension that's rooted in what has always been sacred ancestral land and the indigenous communities that live there. And they're questioning, who does this benefit, this project? Does it benefit car buyers somewhere else in the world? Who carries the risk when we build this huge mine? Who's going to be here to clean it up if something goes wrong or when, the resources are finished? And then to the end-of-life problem, in Mongolia, there's this emerging issue with those older electrified hybrids. They're moving into a place that doesn't have any proper disposal system. And these are really old cars, right? And they're working in extreme conditions, as I said. naturally, the batteries are failing much faster than they would if you or I are driving them in our place. And the Prius, they can swap out these batteries. Sometimes they do the full battery change or even cell by cell. So a lot of the work these days is mechanics who are just doing battery changes for Priuses. But Mongolia then is struggling to track and deal with what's left, all of those batteries. So that's creating these safety and environmental risks. And previously, those batteries were being sent back to Japan through Russia. That's now illegal. So now you have a situation where mounting tens of thousands of batteries, and I saw them. I managed to track down this facility that was kind of in the shadows, collecting all of these batteries, waiting for regulations to change. But there's no system here, and I think it's a really important lesson for countries that want to start bringing in more of these cars. Unless you're building up some transparent system to understand what are the risks here, you're going to end up with a problem like the Mongolia is facing right now.
I want to take you back, Jack, to Indonesia and the Philippines. I'm wondering, do they have the leverage, because of the nickel and copper deposits that they have? Or is the future one where they are going to be, dependent on China indefinitely?
I think it's a tough question for me to answer and for them to answer. Governments are reckoning with this right now. Of course, they do have some leverage because they have the minerals, and these minerals are highly strategic, and they're hard to replace or hard to get from elsewhere. And Indonesia has shown that by using these types of export controls, it can push investment into its local refining, into its kind of local industry. So that does give them a little bit more sway. But China ultimately here has the major influence. I don't think you can argue against that, because even though these countries may own that ore, it's the Chinese firms that have supplied so much of the funding and the technology and the projects. And when we're talking about the Philippines, they have even less leverage because it just doesn't have that downstream capacity. It doesn't have the refineries. And whichever country controls the refining, the battery chemistry, and all these important supply chains and technologies is going to have the strong hand. And right now, that's China.
Understood. So before I let the both of you go, I just want to ask you what you think this EV landscape is going to be looking like maybe 10 years, 20 years from now? I mean, is there going to be one dominant player, you think, or is there going to be multiple players in the market? Bong, maybe you can tell us, what sort of plans, Beijing has in terms, longer term plans, obviously. I mean, of course, in terms of, I guess, developing and growing this EV ecosystem.
I think most of the people I've spoken to, the consultants and the analysts, they think that the price war will thin out the herd. So the brands that survive will be stronger for it. But they also describe this market that hasn't still settled. So there's some bigger companies who need to exit before things stabilize. And inside China itself, most analysts expect the EV share to keep climbing to potentially 80% or higher. So the fleet could be well past 100 million vehicles. So from my colleague Melody's reporting, the upstream looks pretty solid for China. So her analyst has said the lithium will likely remain a core battery material for at least 5 to 10 years. So even newer alternatives like sodium-ion batteries are likely to favor China because they can be made on adapted production lines in the country's existing factories. And the service side, which is what I focused on, is what everyone I spoke to called the unanswered question. So there are two possible paths. Either the training pipeline gets big enough, fast enough, and there are real efforts on the ground actually. We see BYD working with at least 10 vocational colleges. The State Council is targeting 30 million workers. We have NIO running partnerships with schools in Anhui. And this person who works in NIO's factory, they told me that they send engineers into the schools, and the schools will send the students to learn on the production line. So, but that's really the institutional response, and it's growing. But it still takes a lot on the state to work on that. or else, maybe there's also the risk of how technology will jump ahead of the workforce entirely. And you could probably have a robot changing a tire, and the nearest battery swap stations, they already work without a human touching a car. So you drive in, the car takes over, and the battery gets swapped and checked automatically. So the straightforward service tasks, the ones that could have been a way into the trade for new workers, might be the first ones that machines take over. And my other colleague, Kim Seong's piece, it pointed out that across Southeast Asia, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, EV adoption is picking up really fast. And in Singapore especially, EVs made up 45% of new car registrations last year. So for those markets, what's happening in China is like a case study in what's possible and in what goes wrong when the infrastructure doesn't really keep up with sales.
Okay, so Jack, what's the thinking in Southeast Asia and Asia? I mean, in particular, in Thailand, we know, it was manufacturing a lot of cars. I think it still is, but is the thinking there to seize the potential opportunities as far as EV, I guess manufacture and I guess being a supplier is concerned?
I mean, I sort of approach this question just from a more simple perspective, is just as a consumer or a road user. Every new Chinese EV brand that pops into our countries, and you probably see it in Singapore, Arnold, and Bong, you would certainly see it. So many of these brands that we've never heard of. And is there an argument to say that every time you see one, it embeds how normal they are, and they transition from being this manufacturer that we don't know to one that you actually drive and to one that you ride around in a city using Grab, for example? And that's what I'm seeing here in Thailand. When you land at Suvarnabhumi Airport, outside the big highway that takes you into the city, it used to be advertisements for the banks, for telecom companies, for food. Now it's all these Chinese manufacturers. And it's really striking that I look at them every time. I think, I don't know this one yet, but it's here. And I just got back from China on a short holiday, and there were so many more that I'd never seen before as well. And so it's kind of just changing our ideas of what EVs are and how comfortable we are with, brands that we didn't know before. And Thailand, of course, as you say, has been a big manufacturing hub for cars for decades. It's a very important industry here, and the government is trying to come to grips with how it can embed itself into that manufacturing chain. Building an EV is not the same as building a conventional vehicle. Yep. There are thousands and thousands of parts in a normal car that just aren't present in these types of cars. And they have this ecosystem of people who are, my expertise might be creating one bolt, and I create millions of them for Toyota every year. And now all of a sudden we don't need that. So definitely you see the tide is shifting, and there's a bigger adoption of these types of cars, and how can countries take advantage of this wave? And the big question though, the big issue is not just production and sales. It has to be solving the questions that we addressed in our series about repair, about charging, about recycling, and about waste. Because if you don't answer all of those questions, you just create big headaches that, is going to leave a legacy for decades.
And obviously the social impact that you were covering and talking about as well. Jack and Bong, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Arnold. Nice to chat.
And thank you very much for watching and listening as well. I'm Arnold Gay. This CNA Correspondent podcast was brought to you by Tiffany Ang, Nat Fetelvero, Zikri Ayman, and Craig Dale. See you next time.